This episode is brought to you by Excel Coaching Academy. Hey guys, I'm really excited to let you know that I started a mindset coaching business. So what I want to do with this business is I want to help entrepreneurs, business owners, salespeople, leaders, and fitness enthusiasts or athletes develop the right mindset to increase revenue, improve business or performance, and overcome the challenges needed to become the best version of themselves. You can get more information about this by emailing info@excelcoaching.academy. So the floor is yours, whatever you want to.
Oh, okay.
Whatever you want to
Great.
say.
So my name's Ginty, and I am a mental health advocate. I live with complex PTSD and major depressive disorder from childhood trauma. I lived 14 years with my abuser, who was my father. And when I was 14, my older brother told a trusted adult about what was happening in our family. And that was the point where my abuser was taken from our home. And I think a lot of people think once the abuser is out of the home that the trauma is over for kids, but that's not necessarily true. So we ended up having to go through the court system because they wanted to press charges and they wanted to put him in prison. But as children, we weren't treated as if we were adults, obviously, but we were kind of pushed back and not really listened too much when it came to time to talk about charges and what had happened to us. We were looked at as pains in the butts, honestly, because they wanted us to be these cookie cutter people, and children just aren't that, especially children who have had trauma. So my two older brothers were better able to talk about the trauma that we had gone through, the abuse. And for me at 14, it was much harder. I was not ready to talk about that at all, so I didn't. And when I finally was able to talk about it, the court system kind of looked at me, the DA, they kind of looked at me as like, oh, you just want to get in on the ride, which what child wants to get in on the ride of putting their abuser in prison? So they put me through a lot of hoops to jump, including going in front of a grand jury to talk about really detailed sexual abuse and physical abuse. And so that was a trauma that I went through all over. Again, having to always talk about it. And when it was over and my abuser was in prison, I didn't want to go through it again. I started just pushing it off. I kept saying, no, I'm not doing this right now. First, it was not yet. I'm in college. I have a life to live, and then not yet. It's a career I'm focusing on, until finally it was not yet. I'm a mom. How could I possibly take time out of these beautiful souls' lives for myself? So I played that game of not yet when it came to really focusing on my trauma. So, I went through motherhood, through a good portion of motherhood, really overwhelmed because I didn't have parents that I could emulate. My father was my abuser. My mother, she was so focused on work and the things that were happening around us, trying to keep us afloat. So I really didn't have those parents that I could trust to learn from, to be a mother. And so over time, I would just keep floating through this thing called motherhood, trying my best. And you know what? I was a good mom. I am a good mom. But I think that I gave myself, a harder time by not having looked at that trauma that I had had. And I owned a shop. I owned a boutique in my town. And I had to close the shop and I had to go into bankruptcy. And suddenly my brain just blew up. I'd lost an identity by leaving the shop, and then going into bankruptcy was just another trauma added on. And my brain stopped me and said, right now, right now, you have to deal with this. I mean, I got the physical, like brain fog and the tiredness and, the overwhelm. And I wasn't doing great with the people that I was with my relationships. And so my brain basically said, you have to focus on this or you can't move forward with your life.
There's a lot there. I appreciate you sharing that. So why do you think it was that you just didn't really want to, I mean, I guess when you say deal with this or handle this or overcome this, I guess that's I'm not really sure what that means, but why do you think it was that you were kind of pushing that, other than I know it was probably painful to I don't want to say overcome, because I don't know if that's something that can ever be overcome, but just kind of work through the situation.
Yeah. It really came down to fear. It was fear that I was not going to be the person other people needed me to be. I grew up as a people pleaser. I took care of everyone around me, my abuser, my brothers, my mother. I was the one, even as a small child, who was taking care of others. So that was an identity to me. How could I possibly step back and take care of me when there are so many other people who I also need to take care of? So I was just, for many reasons, the fear that I was not going to be able to function in this world if I really went deep into my trauma. It was overwhelming. And, it took a lot to go through my everyday and kind of push it down and push it away. But I felt that it was my duty to do that because I'm these two little souls' mother, and I'm a wife. I'm an employee, or I'm a daughter. All these other identities meant more to me than my own, I guess.
Yeah, man. What I find the fact that we're having this conversation right now at this point in time, I think is fascinating to me, because I just talked to someone yesterday who we were talking about hypnotherapy. And I think there's a lot of potential there maybe for things like this, PTSD and complex PTSD. And one of the things that we stumbled, or that one of the realizations I stumbled on in that conversation was like, you think about something like depression or anxiety or something, and those seems to be conditions that a person lives with. And I don't know, I guess it varies by the person. It's a spectrum, I'm sure, but it's like with PTSD or maybe complex PTSD, and maybe we should maybe flesh out what the difference is, but it's like, it seems like from the outside looking in that's like it differs from anxiety and depression because it's like a continuous response to an event, and I don't know if maybe that feeling of pushing that away, I don't know if that was like that continuation of that response. I don't know, but maybe I guess the question would be, well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So a lot of people who are in trauma learn to compartmentalize, to put things in boxes and put them away. Because when you're in constant trauma, like you are in complex PTSD, and I'll go through exactly, I'll give you like the differences and all that kind of stuff so that you really have a good idea. But I think when people are in trauma, they learn to put parts of themselves in boxes and push them aside so that they can focus on the current box that they want to be in. And that kind of stuff also causes dissociation, where, people can go a period of time with not realizing what they were doing. So It's all small, different things that happen inside of trauma. And I'll tell you the description of PTSD versus complex PTSD as I was told by a social worker, and it really helped me a lot. So imagine that you're in a really bad car crash. Like, it was bad. You were driving, you got hurt, someone else might have gotten hurt, and you're in the hospital. All these horrible things happened, and you become unable to get over that fear of getting back into a car. So over time with PTSD, you can start to relearn how to get back into the swing of things, let's say. So let's say one day you get into the car in the passenger side. And then another day you decide you're going to try getting in behind the wheel of the car. You don't have to turn it on or anything like that, but you take small steps and you work through the fear that you have of driving again. Maybe you get into another accident immediately. These are the type of things that come up in your head when you have this kind of trauma. So eventually you start really working up to being able to drive your car without that anxiety, that stress that came in the beginning when you first had that accident. So that's PTSD. Complex PTSD is that you have lived in trauma for a long period of time. And that's like childhood abuse, domestic violence, veterans who are at war, or even homelessness is considered a trauma that you can develop complex PTSD with. And so what it does is it ends up changing your body chemistry. It changes the neurons in your brain to be hyper aware, to be hyper focused on what's around you, hypersensitive to the feelings that you have, hyper aware, hyper conscious, and you're at a different level of stress than the average human being because your body is constantly waiting for that trauma to happen. So it builds inside of you. And it's not something that's easily just washed away, right? It's something that has to be unlearned or refocused in changing your body chemistry and changing the neurons, the pathways in your brain.
Yeah, I would say that's a pretty significant difference. So I guess, does that mean that PTSD is like the event, or maybe a few events, and then complex PTSD is more of a longer time frame, with
Yes.
many different events? Okay.
Yes.
And then it sounds like complex PTSD is more of your body almost anticipates the trauma or whatever the event was.
Yeah. I mean, from personal memories stuff, that is something that my brothers and I lived constantly, not knowing what our abuser would do. Like, we were not able to trust our own minds because no matter what we would think would happen, our abuser may be in a totally different mood, or something might have kicked something off for him, and suddenly we're being abused. So we were taught from a very early age to be aware and ready for some sort of physical assault or an emotional, mental assault on us.
Gosh, I mean, the fact of not knowing anything, even if it's something simple, I mean, just the fact of not knowing, I can't imagine that on top of, a traumatic experience. Okay, so with PTSD, you hear a lot about a person who experiences this, and then something happens outside the event where I don't want to use the word trigger, but for lack of a better word, it triggers this response. But so my understanding of this is that complex PTSD, I mean, there may be a trigger, but it's like the response is continuous. It's like it's not like they, I'm not really sure how to ask this, because it's like PTSD is there's something that triggers a response to the memory of the event, and then complex PTSD is more like a mindset, maybe, that's been built around the series of events. Is that somewhere close?
Yeah, you know what? The word trigger is a correct word to use. Trigger can happen in, yes, the PTSD and complex PTSD, but it's just the way that a complex PTSD survivor has, their body is more conditioned to accept it and a lot of people who are survivors have their own ways of dealing with it. Again, there's that compartmentalizing, or a lot of people who have PTSD, they dissociate. And, dissociation is something that I think is a term that a lot of people don't necessarily understand. It's dissociating is kind of like just leaving a situation. Your mind kind of like leaves a situation, and there can be a period of time that goes by that you don't know what happened because of it. And a lot of people who are survivors, they do that because their triggers are too much for them.
Mm. So, okay. So when you talk about things like emotional awareness and like being aware of this, like this is something that you've really learned firsthand. Like it's not like, just because I mean I think emotions, I think that's a popular conversation that's going on right now, and being aware of emotions, especially men, because I think for a lot of times there, a longest time, men, weren't really aware of their emotions, or if they did, maybe they didn't think they were supposed to have them or whatever. But it's like, I think in your situation and people who are experiencing these kind of things, it's like the emotions, you really have to understand them. I feel like to understand what exactly is going on, and
Yeah.
what, I mean, I feel like it's absolutely critical to the whole healing process. And maybe not. I mean, again, this is just from the outside looking in, speculative. But so I feel like this, when you talk about emotional awareness, I feel like this is something you've really dove into as far as understanding maybe what this stuff means, these emotions or whatever, and not just in this part of your life, but just in any part,
Yeah, you know what? I think that a lot of us have learned throughout our lives to stuff down our emotions and not show them. And, like you probably heard many times, don't make your grandma uncomfortable with your sadness. Don't be an angry child. These are the things that we were told when we were younger to make other people feel better. So when we continue to stuff these feelings down and they come up, we don't have a recognition of what is supposed to happen when we feel that. So there are a lot of different modalities for people with PTSD and complex PTSD, their therapies. And one of them that I learned specifically for complex PTSD is called DBT. It's dialectical behavioral therapy. And it dives into the world of emotions in general. And it focuses on distress tolerance and, interpersonal communication and mindfulness and emotion regulation. And I think emotion regulation is a big word these days. A lot of people are saying you need to regulate your emotions, but we're not taught how to do that. So DBT helps us to better recognize the emotions that we're feeling and to have coping skills for the intensity of those emotions that we feel. And it was created for people with PTSD, but I think it's an amazing therapy that everyone should learn about. Instead of shoving those emotions down, all our emotions are valid. Let's feel them. And let's learn how to cope with them so that we can be more emotionally intelligent people.
Yeah, I think emotional intelligence, man, I think that's something that we really need to shine a light on that, I feel like, because I don't know why, man. I just feel like for whatever reason, a lot of people, and it's a lot of men, I guess, I don't know why, but it seems like majority of men feel this way, that a specific emotion, like, it's easy for us to label a lot of emotions as negative, like, sadness or anger or whatever. And these things are obviously negative if you express them onto another person or thing. But I think I've been under the impression that these emotions can really teach you a lot about yourself or about your situation if you can allow yourself to listen or to just be present, maybe even with what the emotion is. I mean, I feel like that's and again, this is just my personal opinion from the outside looking in. It seems like it's a very good way to communicate with yourself about what you're doing about a certain thing or process or experience or whatever. I mean, I just feel like that's the only way that what other communication tool do you have with yourself that would be up to par with emotions,
Right. Yeah.
And so I feel like it's absolutely critical for us to be able to learn how to process that. But I guess the key there would be processing and understanding versus expressing, because I do think sometimes it's not necessarily the case that you should just express, like if you're angry about something, you shouldn't necessarily just express that. I mean, there's a healthy way to do it, I feel like.
Mhm.
But I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So, like you said, men have definitely been taught, do not show your emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Any of the emotions, really. You can't even show joy, because maybe that feels like you're putting another man down if you show joy, or another person down if you show an emotion. And every single emotion is there to tell us something, like you said, to ourselves and to others. Anger tells us that there's something that may be harming us, or, we are being threatened. So anger comes up so that we tell our bodies to be ready. And anger is one of those emotions that, even though it feels out of control, it feels more in control than other emotions. For me, I couldn't express fear when I was a child. That was like liquid gold to my abuser. So I had to jump to another emotion so that I didn't show that fear. And what I jumped to was anger, because anger felt more in control and safer for me. So we tend to, as we grow up, learn these little ways of protecting ourselves, and emotions play a big role in that for us. Fear is telling us that we're in danger. Sadness is telling us that we're losing something that we hold dear. These are just some of the things that our emotions tell us. And when we're taught to just push them down, not to feel them, not to show them, we don't know how to actually cope with them.
Yeah. That's fascinating, because if you really analyze things, it's crazy how much fear is actually a motivator behind a lot of things. I mean, anxiety, I think, is an obvious one, but things like, I feel personally that anxiety, I think, is a big one. I feel that jealousy is really motivated by fear, because it's fear that this this person is going to do something or have something that you feel like you don't have. I mean, I feel like that's fear motivated, but there's a lot of things that I feel like fear really motivates. But so I think you mentioned that in your specific circumstances dealing with the PTSD and the complex PTSD, you said fear, you couldn't, did you say express fear?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you feel that's a common thing for people who are experiencing this PTSD and complex PTSD?
Depends on their trauma. Yeah.
Okay.
So, with a child who is being abused, the abuser looks for those signs that they're getting something out of the child. And the same can be said with domestic violence, too. Sometimes abusers really feed off of seeing the emotions of another person. So that person learns how to manage that so that they're not in even more danger. They talk a lot about fight or flight, but there are other things too. There's freeze and fawn. And a lot of trauma survivors learn how to fawn, so that they are fawning their abuser. They're giving this extra love and care and saying how much they love them and adore them, that kind of thing, so that the abuser will step back and stop the abuse. So we really learn a lot of different techniques on how to try to best survive.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say that unfortunately what it sounds like is, the suppression of that emotion is linked to survival.
Yeah.
Which means, of course, through the healing process, I'm assuming that you have to maybe learn how to express that, or how to, or maybe how to feel that. I mean, what do you think? Like, healing from that, if it's something that you're comfortable sharing, what do you think that that process is? Like, just heal, like, healing from that, and being able to, because the reason I'm asking you this is so that somebody else can hear this if they're in this situation and kind of learn from this. So if you're in this situation and you feel like you can't express fear, um, I think it's safe to say that in life there's going to be times that come around that you might feel fearful about things. So, like, how do you what do you recommend to people? Like, how do you recommend people heal from that, not being able to express, well, even if it's not fear, if it's something else, whatever, and there's
Yeah.
this emotion, but then for the longest time they've unfortunately had to link survival to that suppression of that emotion. I mean, what would be your advice to somebody in that situation?
So, for someone who has lived through trauma and they're no longer in the trauma, they have to teach their bodies basically over again how to live without the stress of fear. And so it's not easy. It's not something we can just say, oh, okay, today I'm just not going to be uh, triggered. I'm not
Hmm.
going to be upset. I'm not going to feel the stress and anxiety that I've felt throughout my life. You just can't do that. I highly suggest building a team. And that is what I did after my brain finally said, right now. When my abuser left, my mother did a lot of great things for us, including she required us to be in therapy. I hated it. I was teenager. And I, learned though through that time that she required it, that it does help.
Hmm.
I didn't necessarily use it to go into the trauma. I used it as an everyday type of, this is how I'm feeling today. Let's talk about it. How can, I work through this and not really get into the trauma. But as an adult, I realized when my brain just stopped that I needed this team, these people to help me through this. I needed an individual therapist who was going to help me through the different therapies that are known for PTSD. I also needed a psychiatrist, or I do have a psychiatric nurse practitioner for medications, because people who are living in this complex PTSD, steeping in it, we can't necessarily take ourselves out of it naturally. Some people try to push off drugs.
Hmm.
They don't want to take them, and that's fine. You have a choice on what you get to put into your body. But I myself needed medication to regulate my body, antidepressants and, things to help me sleep, because a lot of people who are survivors of abuse are so hyperactive at night because they have memories of things that had happened to them. They don't sleep well. And
Hmm.
as anybody knows, if you don't get good sleep,
Oh yeah.
that you're not going to be able to keep going. You
Hmm.
have to have that sleep. So I also I went into inpatient hospitalization. I'm lucky to live near one of the premier mental health hospitals in the country. So I went in and worked on my medications and made sure that I had the appropriate medications for me to be able to move forward out in the world.
Hmm.
So we did that. And, I also did some group therapy, which that was another thing I hated when I was a kid. Like, again, why would I want to be sitting with a bunch of kids talking about these kind of things? But as an adult, you kind of find this community.
Hmm.
And as an adult, I've realized community is really important when it comes to this kind of stuff. You have people who understand, have been through it, and can, back you up on things. It's
Hmm.
actually in the group therapy that I created my doll, my Moody Monster, because of that community. And so I went through those steps. My individual therapist, it's a really funny story. I asked a social worker to help me find one, and she introduced me to a woman who was much younger than me. And I was probably about 45, probably back then. And I was like, she can't help me. This young kid can't help me with all of my problems. How could she know what to do? But it was amazing because my therapist was getting all of the new information for the new therapies to help with complex PTSD, with anxiety. So she had learned these things that maybe an older therapist may not know and won't bring into a relationship. So I highly recommend getting a team together so that you're not alone. You shouldn't ever be alone in this.
Yeah, I think, man, I think just knowing that you're not alone, I think is huge for anything, but especially something like this, because I can only imagine, if something like this is going on, and then you add on top of that you feel alone, I don't know that anything that would make it worse. But I think the issue there is, it's not that nobody knows how you're feeling. It's just that you have to find the people that have been there that kind of in that situation. I agree. I think community for whatever it is huge. Let me see. You were talking about the so the therapy part of it, talking to therapists, professional people. I agree with that also. I think that's the benefits from that I think are huge. There was something I wanted to touch on there.
While you think about it, there's another great reason to get an individual therapist. They are not a part of your world. You are not going to tell your family and friends everything.
Right.
But when you have an individual therapist, you can say whatever you need to say. They understand you. And then you don't see them in your regular everyday life. It's genius, actually.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think, I think a lot of people feel like, again, just somebody to understand where they're coming from. I think like nobody is really honestly going to understand who you are, where you're coming from. I mean, people might know the majority of it, but nobody's going to really be able to understand. But I feel like a professional who works with this on a routine or everyday basis, I feel like that's an obvious thing. Because like you're right, your family and friends and people, I think they probably mean well in most situations and they want to help you, and I understand that. But I think you cannot debate the power of a professional who does this for a living. I mean, I just feel like that's gosh, I lost my train of thought. I was going to ask you a question, completely forgot what it was. You go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I was just thinking back to what we were talking about and thinking, let's see, we talked about emotion regulation. We talked about feelings. The whole primary to secondary emotion jump is fascinating. And it actually, DBT actually helps with that, jumping from fear to another emotion like anger, with, really, it's called checking the facts. And what you do is I'll bring up another car situation. I guess cars are triggering for me. I don't know. But I live in Massachusetts. I don't drive nicely.
Okay.
So let's say that you're driving your car, maybe you're on the highway, and someone cuts you off really quickly. And what's the first thing you think? Oh my God, I'm going to hit this person, right? That fear comes into it. But then you jump to being so angry at that person for cutting you off, right? And we all do it. We all jump from that fear primary emotion to anger. And doesn't it feel more comfortable, more safe, more, in control, as opposed to this fear that you felt that you were going to hit someone? But in the end, fear is the emotion that we should be dealing with and not anger. So like DBT teaches this thing, checking the facts, where you need to step back from the emotion of it all, look at each individual thing that happened and figure out, well, what is the emotion I'm supposed to be feeling in this moment? And then dealing with that emotion.
that's actually a really good point. Yeah, that's a really good point. And you mentioned emotional regulation. That's what I was going to ask you about, because I think you and I have talked before about the book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yes.
And so one of the stories that he shares in there very early on is about the Vietnam veterans. And, when they, a person experiences something like that, a war zone or whatever, and then they come back to civilian life, and it's like there's nothing that's going to, hopefully there's nothing that's going to match the intensity of that. And so my understanding is that these people have a difficult time finding a place to my understanding is to feel normal because of what felt normal to them for so long. So, am I, with the people that you have talked to, do you see that as like, is there a problem, or like is it hard for these people? I don't want to say transition, because that makes it seem like there's something wrong with them, but for these people who experience this PTSD or complex PTSD, and they sort of, thankfully get out of that situation, whether it's a war zone or abusive relationship, and they sort of move into a life that doesn't have those events in it. How do you handle, going from that, being chronically in that state? And I guess maybe that's all the things that we're talking about here, but like the emotional regulation part of it. How would you recommend to a person not, I guess, being in that perpetual state? And I guess that's what complex PTSD is taking that state with you to a place that no longer, you're in a completely different space now.
Yeah.
And I guess that's where the emotional regulation comes in. So I guess that would be the question. How do you, outside of that situation, how do you regulate your emotions when you're no longer in it, if that makes sense?
Yeah. That's the $10,000 question.
Yeah.
That's where the team comes in, because
Okay.
it's jarring. It's so jarring to come from a place of constant trauma into a place of peace. It doesn't feel right. It feels alien. And I don't know if you've ever watched the show. It's called Shrinking on Apple TV. And there's a character in it who has come back. He's a veteran, and he's having such a hard time. He's actually easily getting into fights.
Yep.
Somebody just ticks him off and he's immediately fighting someone, and he ends up having to go to, court ordered psychiatric help for it. And, it's a really interesting show. It's a fun show. It's, a sweet, kind show. So I highly recommend it to people. And it also does help you to understand how it can be so hard for someone coming back from a war zone to come back into your parents' house and interacting with people who have no idea what you've been through. They're going around, buying groceries. You're at the grocery store. You're bumping into these people who have absolutely no idea what is going on inside your head, right? It's really important for people who are going through that to get a therapist who truly understands that complex PTSD issue.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I've seen people sort of in that space who have taken that, I don't want to say energy, but for lack of a better word, taken that sort of energy and pushed it into, started a business or whatever it was. And I understand that's an oversimplification. I know it's not that simple, but I'm saying, like, these guys, like The Body Keeps the Score, the book with The Body Keeps the Score. I think that gentleman, not to spoil the book for anybody, but the gentleman in that story, I think he started some sort of business or community or something with these other veterans, and that was like his space. That's where he was able to go and have this community, like what we talked about. And then he's also putting this energy into this thing. And it's like I've said before on the podcast that I feel like a lack of purpose. If a person doesn't have purpose, I feel like that's not good for anybody. That I feel like that's where I've heard people say that that's what fuels addictions and all these unwise choices. And I just feel like if we have a sense of purpose, if we have a calling that's bigger than ourselves, I feel like that will, like, I had Roy Launder on the podcast in the past, and he talks about overcoming, he had a crack addiction, this kind of thing. One of the things he said that helped him was having something that he felt like was bigger than himself. So now he's out, helping other guys who was in his situation. And it's like just taking that and then blending it in with a sense of community. I just think that's a fascinating thing. And I feel like with is it your Moody Monster?
Yeah.
I feel like you've kind of taken that and done sort of something similar,
Exactly.
So what is that? What's the Moody Monster?
Sure. So as I said before, I was in a therapeutic group and I was having a really, really hard time with my symptoms. They were bad. And I was talking about how frustrated I was with them. And I said, I wish I had a monster that I could just rip apart and throw across the room and bang against the wall. And people in the group were like, yeah, you should have that. and I was like, oh, okay. So I went home, and I'm not a seamstress or a tailor or anything, but I put together this, like, I don't know, like ragtag monster plush doll, but I made the head, arms, and legs of Velcro so I could rip them apart. And I named him PTSD Pete. And I love alliteration. You'll hear My Moody Monster. My LLC is Phoenix Freed. Like, I had to do it all out of that. So I created Pete, and I started using Pete, and I realized that Pete was really helping me out. And I figured Pete could help other people out too, especially kids. Because kids are little cavemen. That's what I called my sons, cavemen, because they're born with all of this and they don't know what to do with it, especially emotions. So I went to the SBA, and they said, you need to go to this nonprofit called E4All in our area. And actually across the country now, E4Alls are starting to pop up everywhere. It's entrepreneurship for all. So I got into an accelerator program and really started building what ended up being My Moody Monster. And Moody has been really helping families and therapists and teachers to help kids transition through those hard emotions. I created Moody as a buddy to rip apart, to get out the big feelings. But the best part about him, I realized, was putting him back together again, because parents and teachers and therapists could put the doll back together with the child and say, what happened? What can we do next time to help better cope with this big frustration you're having? And giving the child a chance to show and to talk about what happened with them. And communication has really been a great tool that Moody has been able to provide for people. And like you said, I did make Moody, and it is my bigger thing now. It is the thing that is driving me. It has been a love letter to my own healing, because Moody's really helped me to bring out the things that I've learned and give them to others.
Yeah. That's great. That's incredible, man. Have you ever read the book Man's Search for Meaning? Victor Frankl. Okay, so Victor Frankl, I should write it down. So he was a Holocaust survivor. He was in the Holocaust. And I think he was also a psychologist or something, maybe a psychiatrist, but he wrote about his experience in the Nazi concentration camp. And one of his big key takeaways was that if you're in some sort of situation, and again, I don't want to oversimplify or minimize anything, but he was like, if you're feeling something that's unpleasant, and if you give a meaning to that thing, or if you find some sort of sense of purpose in that thing, he said that it was one of the things that helped him sort of, and I'm paraphrasing here, but one of the things that helped him get through the concentration camps. And I don't know if you had this experience. I think back on some things in my life, and I think of, I felt like this then. This is the story that I'm going to tell myself of what that meant. And this is how I'm going to use that, to help better myself or someone around me or someone connected to me. And that just, to me, that makes, I guess, healing, for lack of a better term, healing a more, it gives purpose to it. It gives purpose to the thing that I experienced. Now, and again, I know we're talking apples to oranges, and where I don't want to minimize, but
No.
I feel like finding the purpose in that, like Viktor Frankl was talking about. I think this is what this reminds me of, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Because like people like you and Roy Launder and all these people that experience these things, and it's not an ideal situation, but you take the situation and then you make something good out of it. I mean, I find that incredible.
Well, Cody, I mean, we could say the same thing about this podcast. You're doing this, right? And you're
Mhm.
giving the world information and, expressing what you want to express to the world. It's important.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think that's what it's all about too. I think it's about. I think we all have a voice that can be heard. And I use the word voice because I think everybody has a voice to be heard, and I think what you're talking about with children, whether they're in a traumatic experience or not, situation or not, a lot of times it's easy for adults to disregard what children have to say. I know. I know others who have been in that situation where, if you're a child, it's like, you're kind of disregarded from the adult conversations. I'm not saying you should be included in them, but I'm saying that I think we should all be listened to, is what I'm saying. We all have a voice.
Yeah.
So I do find what you're doing incredible. Where can you be found? Do you have social media, websites? Do you have anything?
Yeah. I have. So you can go on mymoodymonster.com, and I sold out of my first batch of Moody's. So I have
Congratulations.
500. Thank you. I just got funding for 500 more. I'm so excited. I already have pre-orders on the site, and you can also pre-order a donation. So part of my social mission is to get Moody's out to first responders and social workers and medical treatment centers for kids that are in trauma. Like kids who have been in house fires or going into foster care or having medical treatments. So you can also do that. And I'm on most of the social medias as My Moody Monster. And then about a month and a half ago, I randomly decided that it was time to do a podcast myself.
Okay.
Yeah. I had realized I'd been talking a lot about that not yet to right now.
Yep.
And so I created a podcast for people to share their stories of that moment that changed them and they went on their healing journeys. So it's called When Not Yet Becomes Right Now. I have 7 episodes so far, but I am like really excited to be able to do that. And it's kind of a running joke because I tell people I created a podcast to run away from my own feelings. I tell my therapist that all the time and she rolls her eyes. But how you were talking about that sense of, you need to make something bigger of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much where I was going with it as well. But Moody is, he's the biggest, like I said, love letter to my healing, and hopefully will be helpful in other people's as well.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on your podcast. Congratulations on Moody too. I know, so the podcasting thing, man, that's an interesting one, because it's first of all, and I say this all the time, we have social media, we have the internet and all this kind of stuff. And I feel like we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we did not use that, to promote healing or, community or whatever. It's easy for us to get on social media and scroll all day endlessly and just kind of waste time. But we can also be productive with it. We can also share messages. We can also talk to people. And I'm glad to see that you're doing that too, because I think that, again, going back to the community thing, I think a lot of people need to be in that space, just to see, well, maybe they don't want to go to a group full of, a room full of people in therapy, but maybe they can go to a podcast and hear something, like one of your stories or somebody that you bring on their stories. And then they could be motivated to say, you know what? Okay, well, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe I can go to therapy. And I think that's what it's all about, man. I think it's about, we're here and we're individuals and we have, all our individual emotions, our individual thoughts, but we're also part of the collective. And I feel like the collective, all the collective is it's a massive thing of everybody on earth, but it's also like what we do individually as our contribution. So I find that incredible.
Well, podcasting is community. That's
Yeah,
what's so
yeah.
beautiful about it. And when you can put out those stories of how people have overcome, people don't feel so alone anymore.
And I think it's going to take that to, because we're going through a lot of changes right now as a society and as
Mhm.
a world. We've experienced a lot of, and I think technology has really boosted that. Even from the early 2000s, we're evolving a lot. And I think it's going to take all of us kind of working together to sort of perpetuate us in I think, a positive direction, but and not be divided by, you know, ideologies and that kind of thing. I think that's important. But one other thing, I know you got to get out of here. One other thing I want to ask you before we
Yes.
close is if you could pinpoint, and I know it's kind of hard to say the most important, but what do you think would one of the most important lessons you've ever learned is? It could be something from your personal journey, if it's you're comfortable sharing, or your career or business. What do you think is one of the most important lessons you've ever learned?
Healing is not linear. It's a roller
Mm,
coaster ride. Your healing journey isn't going to have an end. When people ask me, where are you at in your healing journey? It's an easy answer for me, in the middle. And maybe in 10 years, I'll still be saying in the middle. But healing day by day doesn't just, you're feeling the same every day. There are going to be the upswings and the way down lows, and you have to give yourself grace in those times. You have to understand that the reason you're feeling low and you're feeling triggered or whatever it is then is because your body isn't able to function with
mm,
it. We need to give ourselves grace and get out of this culture where if you're not working and doing something, you're doing nothing.
mm.
Being
Yep.
able to step back and give yourself that grace is healing. And you'll have another day to run around and do all the stuff that you feel you need to do. But it's not linear. You have to understand that you're on a roller coaster ride and it's okay.
Yep. I think that reminds me that, it's we think a lot about how other people treat us and how other people talk to us, but very few of us are conscious of how we treat ourselves and how we talk to ourselves. You know,
Yeah.
so I love that. I love that message. Listen, I appreciate it. I'm gonna let you go and get out of here. If you can hang out for just a second, I'm gonna explain to you the upload process. But I do appreciate your time here, and congratulations on what you're doing on your podcast. And I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you so much for having me on. It was a great conversation.
Hey, listen, guys, I really appreciate you tuning in today. If you enjoyed this podcast, if you found it useful or beneficial, you can subscribe, follow, interact, and see more content at Pure Wisdom Podcast. This is all social medias: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Rumble, Spotify, Amazon Music, and Google and Apple Podcasts. Again, we appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next time.